us all. A brief introduction before I turn it over to Dr. Androff. He is a professor and associate director for doctoral education at the Arizona State University School of Social Work. His research focuses on human rights, social development, and immigrants and refugees. He was elected Fellow of the Society for Social Work and Research in 2023 and received the Partners in Advancing Education for International Social Work Award from the Global Commission of the Council of Social Work Education in 2022. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Androff.
Hi, welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Good morning from Arizona and good afternoon to everyone in New York. And thank you for that lovely introduction. I will try to do that justice as I share about my work and my thoughts as it relates to Sustainable Development Goals. So I've prepared some material here. I can advance myself. So I thought I would start by introducing myself in terms of where I started from understanding Sustainable Development Goals, which was 0, and then how I've ended up today talking to you about this, sort of how did I get here, and then do a brief orientation and overview of some of these core topics, basically on the Sustainable Development Goals, human rights, social work, and then the new handbook that Laura was showing you, which I'm delighted that you have a physical copy to look at. I'll spend some time kind of reviewing it and talking about some of the cases, and then close with some reflections, implications, and hopefully we'll definitely have time for questions and discussions if you're so interested. So I can't beat the introduction that was already given for myself. I'll just add that my practice background really started as a social worker. My social work practice background really started in human rights. And I was originally practicing in jails and in prisons in California, where I was a graduate, where I went to grad school. And in particular, I worked on death penalty cases. And that really grounded me in the human rights field. And then when I went to do my PhD, I ended up studying Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, which is also really conceived as a human rights intervention. But I was there as a social worker, both working on death penalty cases, studying Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. I had a chance to practice on work on one Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And everywhere I went, people would say, "Oh, why are you in social work? What is a social worker doing here?" It was frustrating. These were lawyers asking me this. And it's frustrating because I thought, well, obviously this, there should be more social workers. And then back in my academic home of social work, people would say, "Why are you off doing those human rights things? Why aren't you doing more traditional mainstream social work things?" And that was equally frustrating to me because I thought, well, isn't this obviously social work also? So that's just a little background to say I'm just so delighted to be visiting the University of Buffalo, even virtually, because I've been such a fan of the work. I really feel like the School of Social Work at Buffalo is really leading the way in terms of integrating human rights content in social work curriculum. And I've been a big fan of your faculty, especially people like Philomena Cortelli, who have really inspired me over the years in this field. And I even had a chance to contribute a book chapter to their trauma and human rights book that I believe is used in the curriculum that was on the topic of Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I feel like I know your school, even from a distance, or at least I'm a big fan of it. But more recently, as was noted, my work is focused more on migration and refugees, particularly human rights elements of global refugee policy, of immigration policy. So that gives me just a moment to show off this other book that came out recently, 2022, from Oxford, that as a global policy analysis of the major United Nations refugee policies. which are called the durable solutions. And look at the data. It's easy to see that most of the displaced people in the world, forcibly displaced people, don't have access to any of the United Nations global refugee policies. So that was sort of a book doing a human rights analysis of those policies, looking, can we say, from a social work point of view, what policies should we be advocating for to promote human rights and sustainable development. But today I'm here to talk about sustainable development goals. And I just wanted to highlight sort of my background in human rights, because originally I'm sort of ashamed, but to admit that I had a very low opinion of environmental justice. And in sort of the hardcore human rights community, especially in the 1990s, environmental rights were not seen as related really to human rights. It was seen as like a secondary thing. It's like, well, there's people, we need to protect the people that are being tortured and killed today. And then there's, save the trees, it's something separate. So I feel like I've really been on a journey over my career to understand the essential connection between environmental justice, social justice, environmental rights, and human rights. And part of that has been working with students. I was teaching basically community practice, macro social practice class, where students would do social change projects in the community. And over the years, more and more of those projects were focused on environmental issues. And I even wrote a paper with students on that subject. It was published in Journal of Social Work Education, called Greening Social Work Education, about incorporating environmental rights in community practice class. And it was actually inspired a whole book that was now published by University of Toronto Press, edited by Susan Hillock. And it's focused on education, social work education. Another experience I had was I was at a conference in the Philippines, and the conference organizers took us on a field trip to visit the site of Mount Pinatubo, which had a massive eruption and devastated local communities in the 1990s. And they taught us how social workers were on the front lines of that, of helping people in communities especially respond to that natural disaster. And that really illustrated the role that social workers have to play in sustainability and environmental justice. And so I think my hopeful vision of social work, I'm always an optimist, is that we should be able to be on the front lines of social change and responding to emerging problems as they develop. And of course, today in this technological world that we live in, it's become in many different ways. So these are actually two AI generated images. The left is, the prompt was social workers at Earth Day, an image to celebrate social workers in Earth Day. And the right was social workers in the SDGs. I think I used Microsoft's Copilot to generate these. So there's a whole host of, emerging trends and issues that I think as a profession and as an academy, as educators, we need to be aware of and on top of and respond to. And so I think focusing on sustainable development goals can help us do that. Just last week, or was it 2 weeks ago now, ASU hosted the GATE conference, which was the Group for the Advancement of Doctoral Education. And I chaired the conference, and I worked with the conference committee to make the theme sustainability in social work doctoral education. And it was an interesting, experience. It went really well. There was a lot of support, but at a certain point in the planning process, I really had to fight to keep this focus on environmental sustainability and social work doctoral education. Without naming names, there were certain, people, involved in social work doctoral education who really didn't get it and were not necessarily supportive of these connections. And it was a broad theme focused on political sustainability, financial sustainability, because there's all these issues in society, as in higher education, that are threatening sort of our model of how we do things. So I thought it was appropriate to spend the conference thinking about talking about those issues, also linking to environmental sustainability. So we invited Dean Lisa Reyes Mason from University of Denver to be the keynote speaker. And I had my colleagues here at ASU, Shenandoah Billiot and Felicia Mitchell, involved, whose work focuses on sustainability in indigenous communities, particularly adaptations to climate change. And Lisa Reyes Mason had written a book on social justice and climate change. Oh, sorry. And then we also got to do a social action event at the conference where one of our doctoral students, Nadia Nemaz, led everybody in an activity of building urban heat relief kits that we could distribute on the border and then also locally and among the unhoused population, because 2023 was the hottest year on record, and we certainly felt that in Phoenix, where we had over 460 heat-related deaths in the city. Actually, the city of Phoenix, this is the first city in the country to establish an Office of Heat Resilience. And so the city is very active in trying to develop plans and policies and programs. There's an ASU professor that leads that office in the city government. And so our doctoral student is working and trying to understand which programs and policies can help. Okay, so let's do a quick overview of the Sustainable Development Goals. I like to start when I teach about the SDGs by asking students to join me in a thought exercise, which is to say, can you imagine at any point in human history that all the world leaders, all the kings and queens and emperors and sheiks and chiefs would come together and reach consensus on a single agenda? And not just, you know, let's get richer or whatever you would think they would like, but let's actually try to help the most vulnerable people. It's really quite remarkable, I think, that we're engaged in this process, even though it might have a lot of flaws. But in some ways, that's exactly what the Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennium Development Goals before them are really all about. And you know, it's really came out of the United Nations Millennium Conference. So in the year 2000, the United Nations launched the Millennium Development Goals, which you know, started, as I'm saying, in 2000 and sort of had this period to run from 2000 to 2015. But like good researchers do, they sort of played with the numbers. And so they actually said, we're going to measure progress on 8 specific goals, but we're going to back count it from 1990. So they sort of gave themselves a padding 10 years, including the 90s. And they agreed on 8 priorities. These are the 8 goals. That was to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, to, you know, achieve universal primary education, gender equality, reducing child mortality, improving maternal health, combating HIV/AIDS and other diseases. Ensure environmental sustainability was included in the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, that are now expired, but it's important to understand the MDGs because they set up the SDGs that started in 2015. And then the 8th was global partnerships for development. So there's always this emphasis on we need better partnerships to achieve the goals. Well, the 7th MDG on environmental sustainability was limited in the sense that it was focused on trying to incorporate sustainable development practices and policies in national development plans. There was also a component on increasing people's access to clean water, sanitation, and a focus on urban health. So these were the original set of goals. They expired in 2015, and then the second fun thing I like to do in class is to ask students, after introducing the goals and explaining what the targets were. These are priorities that the world set for itself in 2000. By 2015, we wanted to eradicate extreme poverty. And then I asked students, do you think we achieved these? typically students will say, no, of course, all of these things, there's so many more challenges related to poverty and education. And I get to say, well, according to the United Nations, you're wrong, because they announced we did achieve the Millennium Development Goals because of the way they were counting, which was again from 1990, and actually their measurable outcome for extreme poverty was actually just reducing it by 50%, which largely thanks to economic development in China we did achieve. However, the MDGs were heavily criticized. And so when it became actually, well before 2015, people were working on the problem of what comes after the Millennium Development Goals. In one sense, the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, achieved remarkable attention and focus, getting people talking about development issues and sort of coordinating global action. But there were so many problems and shortcomings, and there's social work articles with scholars criticizing the MDGs for lack of human rights attention, and even the ones that are, even the targets that are included, just the way that they measure them is not always the best way. So in 2015, after years of negotiating and planning, Sustainable Development Goals were released. And these are significantly more comprehensive, and you could also say more complicated. I won't name all the 17 goals, but I encourage you to look them up if you're interested, because there's a ton of information, data, YouTube videos, going in depth all about the SDGs. But I just highlight a few of what I consider to be the main features of the SDGs.
Sorry.
So the 17 goals obviously is more than the 8 goals of the MDGs. So they've more than doubled the number of goals. But also I think the MDGs, as I was referencing with MDG 7 and environmental sustainability, I think there was only 21 targets underneath those 8 goals, sort of the operational targets. I named 2 or 3 of the ones under MDG 7. In total across the 8, there's something like 21. So now there's 17 SDGs with 169 targets. So it's much larger, much more comprehensive, much more robust. These targets are specific objectives that are meant to guide and measure progress towards achieving these goals by 2030. That's why sometimes the SDGs are referred to as Agenda 2030. So these features are important because one of the major criticisms of the MDGs was that they were largely focused on the quote unquote poor nations of the world, or what's referred to as the global south. Whereas the SDGs, in trying to compensate for that, are really focused on both global north and the global south. And that comes in part from the environmental movement and climate justice perspective that recognizes the global north is primarily responsible for greenhouse gas emissions that is being felt throughout the global south. So it's more universal. It's more integrated in the sense that it blends the development agenda with the climate agenda, even with the foreign aid agenda. So these used to be separate meetings and separate agendas, but under the SDGs, they've really blended and built together multiple priorities of the United Nations into one focused place. So that's a plus, but it kind of results in this sense of there's 17, this awkward number, is sort of included everything. It's notable that they were a lot more interactive and reflects a much broader partnership, whereas the MDGs were much more top-down, developed by state governments, led by state governments. There's actually significant public input in developing the SDGs from around the world. And there's all through them a recognition that it requires partnerships with civil society and not just governments. So I think that's a big opportunity for social work there. And the SDGs prioritize inclusivity and equity they've been called the leave no one behind agenda. So whereas the NDGs focused on, in general, reducing poverty rates, across the board, the SDGs explicitly mention and are designed to focus on specific vulnerable and marginalized populations, including people with disabilities, indigenous peoples. And so overall, they're more comprehensive and more ambitious set of goals. And like I said, there's a ton of data and tracking, and there's really interesting resources online. So I encourage everybody to go check them out. However, they're not perfect, and I think there's always sort of an element of what's the point of these goals? I think it's important to keep a critical lens and say, like, is this overall, is this helping or not? And on balance, I think it's probably good to have a focused, targeted agenda that we can all sort of rally behind and use sort of common language here. But there's significant problems with the Sustainable Development Goals. They're largely voluntary, as were the MDGs, so there's always the problem of lack of accountability. They really are only as good as their implementation, which depends certainly on resources. Even the idea of tracking progress and measurement, that also relies on the quality of the data that's collected. So there's problems with that. And then what I really want to emphasize is that I believe these require social work element to implementation. In my experience, sort of anecdotally, much of the focus in the conversation and the broader literature on the Sustainable Development Goals has tended to emphasize the harder, quote unquote, harder sciences. So there's a lot of focus on engineering, developing new forms of energy, which is excellent and certainly needed. And there's a whole project at ASU about developing better light bulbs. But I think overall, there's a lack of recognition that no matter what we develop, whatever technology it is, there's always going to be a social dimension. That's I think a crucial element of social work, which is working with communities and people to to achieve these big social transformations. They've also been criticized for being overly ambitious, unrealistic. There is a degree of incoherence or incompatibility in some of the goals. There's one SDG that focuses on promoting economic growth, which is certainly can be a useful tool towards reducing poverty. But also there's another separate SDG that's focused on reducing consumption and sort of promotes like a degrowth perspective. So that a lot of people have raised a concern about, well, how do we do things? How do we soften the impact of the economic growth on the environment at the same time promoting more economic growth? So how do we reconcile these? And then there's some topics that are not as centered in the goals as we would like, especially topics like migration and race, which I'll come back to. So I think it's appropriate to pause before we get more into social work and the SDGs to ask about human rights and try to understand the connection between human rights and sustainable development goals. As I mentioned, there's been a strong rights-based critique of both the MDGs and the SDGs. These critiques basically say that these are not, that the MDGs represent basically like a neoliberal development agenda, and the SDGs to some extent echo that. And so they've really selected particular rights to highlight, where they've left out other human rights concerns. And even more with the Sustainable Development Goals, as they've brought in the focus from government to include civil society, there's also acknowledgement and attention to the private sector, which leads to concerns about the commodification of rights. So it's one thing to say we're going to have an SDG focused on the right to clean water, but it's another thing to say, well, who's paying for that and who owns those water rights? and who's benefiting. And then with both sets of goals, there's a strong critique about, do these goals really achieve the kind of social transformation that would be necessary to resolve these issues and promote social justice, or are they going to be replicating the global order as it is? So there's a question about how much attention do they pay towards structural inequality. So those are, I think, valid and fair and necessary critiques. So I'll just offer my thoughts, which is even though I've worked in the field of human rights, I've never felt and hope never gave the impression that I think human rights are some perfect tool or perfect panacea, perfect solution. I just happen to think they're one particular tool that I don't see social workers using as much as we should. So I've always tried to promote the idea of using human rights as a tool of practice, as a tool to guide practice, and especially advocacy and policy analysis. And I think there's several benefits to using human rights, which is that in large part, they represent an international consensus. So we don't have to spend as much time arguing for people to agree with the end result. You know, they represent these universal interrelated principles, these universal goals, even though a lot, I think too much of focus on human rights, even in social work, focuses on the the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the conventions, the treaties, the agreements, which is important. Yet that, I'm afraid, gives people the picture, the false sense that these are static documents with a period at the end of it that live in Geneva or somewhere away from me. And in fact, the concept of human rights in the literature is always evolving. So it's actually quite dynamic. And I see rights-based approaches in human rights as being compatible and complementary to sustainable development. And I think we need both to achieve what's hopefully larger social justice. So in some ways, I see sustainable development is providing, a pathway to achieve human rights, which are certain standards, which once achieved could result in social justice. And just in passing out, when I mentioned another book that I wrote called Practicing Rights, which tries to break down my view of how to incorporate human rights-based approaches in basic fields of social work practice, including child welfare, working with older adults, working with children and adolescents, health, and mental health. And the basic concept is that, again, I don't think it's useful to necessarily get lost in the weeds and the Geneva documents. However, I think there is sort of a heart and soul of human rights, what I call the human rights-based principles, that we can and should be incorporating into fundamental aspects of social work, whether it's education, clinical practice, advocacy. And these include the principles of human dignity, such as respecting self-determination, combating dehumanization, promoting rehumanization, and switching our lens so that we see people as rights holders, not as vulnerable or weak, or passive recipients of aid, or needy people. The human rights-based principle of non-discrimination, preventing discrimination on any basis, but also attending to historically excluded populations, promoting cultural appropriateness, cultural humility, and non-hierarchy social workers. Human rights-based principle of participation. Participation is such a fundamental principle in human rights. It refers to both process and a goal. It relates to the disability rights slogan of nothing about us without us. And it's about working with people to empower communities so that they can participate in decisions and affect decisions that are made about their community and affect their well-being. Transparency, typically in human rights, refers to anti-corruption efforts, but I think as a human rights-based principle in social practice, could relate to assessment, assessing whose rights are being violated, which rights are being violated, who's the responsible party for those rights, and promoting research and evaluation, and then also a reflective piece. Finally, accountability includes advocacy, lobbying, promoting justice, and raising awareness, promoting human rights culture. So I think taking this approach, understanding human rights-based approaches to social work practice, we can see how human rights can be incorporated into the Sustainable Development Goals. And this particular perspective on human rights, I think, is summed up well by this quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, one of the founding mothers of the modern human rights movement, contemporary of Jane Addams. So I think we can sort of claim Eleanor Roosevelt too as a related founding mother to social work, who has this great quotation about human rights being essential to being integrated into our daily lives, whether it's our office, school, classroom. This line of it, unless these principles have meaning interpersonally between you and me, home, work, and it really doesn't matter if they're ratified by national governments. Okay, so moving back to the Sustainable Development Goals and the particular role of social work. Like I said, I don't think it's useful to go through all the 17 goals in detail at this point, but I hope that by looking at the list, you might see immediately there are certain goals which are congruent with social work practice, social work education, social work research. I think, in particular, these goals are the ones with the greatest relevance to social work. I think there's some consensus about this, particularly goals 1 through 5 and 16. Those are actually, if I had to highlight one, I would say SDG 3, which is a goal focused on health and well-being. It probably the majority of what we understand of social work could fit in either reducing poverty, promoting health and well-being, education, gender equality, and building strong institutions, peace and justice. Another way to think about the connection between social work and the SDGs is the SDGs' own language, which is called this 2030 Sustainable Development Goal Agenda, the Leave No One Behind agenda. And I heard the United Nations official give a talk once talking about the role of social work and the importance of social work in implementing SDGs. And he referred to social work as the Leave No One Behind profession. I thought that was a great label for our profession. It's something that I hope we can aspire to. So I want to now turn to the handbook and share a little bit about the contents, the contributors, and the topics that are covered, and hopefully that provides some illustrations and some sense of how social workers are involved in the Sustainable Development Goals, and can be involved in the Sustainable Development Goals. This is a brand new edited book, just came out in 2024. It was quite an effort. It's over 600 pages. Just for fun, I had Microsoft Word count the words. You do the word count, and it's almost 250,000 words. There's 74 authors and 35 chapters, but really the heart of those 35 chapters, as I'll show you, I'll take you through some of the chapters, are the 23 country-level case studies from around the world, where written by people in the specific countries, by the way, because most of the literature on the SDGs, and frankly, international social work, global social work, it's written by people in Europe, in the United States, and Canada. There's just not enough contribution. And so there's a real, as with almost every other pattern in the world, there's a significant global inequality. And it also shows up in academic publishing. So I was trying to rectify that through this handbook. So for example, my co-editor, Anton Dominic, is from Indonesia. And anyway, the 23 country level case studies are written by people in those countries about how social work is implementing the SDGs or struggling to implement the SDGs in a variety of capacities. And I'm really proud of the different contributors, mostly because, like I said, of who's included, but also quite proud that there's 4 current or former presidents of major international social work organizations that are included, including the International Association of Schools of Social Work, the International Federation of Social Work. There's 2 social work representatives to the United Nations who are involved, many more people. So the book was inspired by a conference in 2019 that I co-chaired with the co-editor, Anton. He's social development professor at the University of Gajah Mada, Yogyakarta, Indonesia, where we held the 21st ICSD conference. And the theme was about strengthening social development. And we use the term social development because not every country has as well of established social work profession. So we sort of use those interchangeably, social development and social work, to achieve the SDGs. And that really began the conversation 2 years before that in the conference planning, and then at the conference, think about the role of the social implementation of SDGs. And then when we were talking to the publisher, they said, don't just do a book based on your conference, make it bigger. So we ended up going big to make it a real global book. And there's 8 different parts. The first part features these 3 chapters that set the context. And they, Jim Midgley wrote the first chapter, and he's really the leader in the field of social development. He's written several books on social development, the theory, the practice of it, history of it. So I was excited to have him join the contributions to write about, in particular, the social development origins of the current sustainable development goals. Sort of how do we get here, and what are the different intellectual strains that contributed to the current moment. Antoinette Lombard is at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, and she's actually just elected the incoming president of International Association for Schools of Social Work. She's been very involved in the global agenda, which is an effort of the last 10 years by the different international social work organizations to have a unified agenda. And so she wrote about the connection between the global agenda for social work and the SDGs. Anna Maria Campanini is the actual outgoing president of IASSW, wrote about the contribution of global social work education, the SDGs. So those are broad and introductory. And I just wanted part 1 to sort of set the stage. And part 2, originally I had conceived of as, let's get social work perspectives on each individual SDG, which proved a little too ambitious. But that's essentially what those first 5 chapters are. There's one chapter looking at specifically the social work contribution to SDG 1, poverty reduction, SDG 5, gender equality, and there's one chapter that looks at social work and all the environmental sustainability and climate change goals in the SDGs. There's a chapter that looks at social work and inequality, and finally governance, specifically United Nations governance. But this section also includes 2 important chapters that focus on things that were left out from the SDGs. So we wanted to include a chapter on migration. Migration is mentioned in 5 of the SDGs, but there is not one specific SDG that's focused on migration. It sort of shows up in different places. And across those 5 SDGs, there's 7 targets that include migration. Some of it's related to like human trafficking, some of it's related to domestic workers. So it just shows up in a few different places. But we have one chapter focused on sort of the lack of an explicit MPG commitment to save migration. And then there's another chapter focused on what the authors call Afrophobia and reparative justice, which you might be more familiar with the term anti-Black racism here in the United States. It's the same idea globally, that there's significant historical contemporary discrimination against people of African descent that is not acknowledged by the 17 SDGs, but certainly relates to all of them. And so that was written by Ade, who serves on the United Nations Permanent Forum for People of African Descent, and really is talking about the role of colonialism, global colonialism, European colonialism, in creating the world order that is the context for the sustainable development goals today. And focusing on global reparations and the reparations movement, or here in the chapter, reparative justice, as a way to address some of these. And if you're interested in reparations, I would refer you to a website called SW4reparations.org. SW4reparations.org. I just gave a talk, or participated on a great panel that focused on reparations here in the United States. So then the rest of the parts, the rest of the 5 parts talks about, these are the 23 country level case studies. And these 5 chapters in these 5 countries really take a national view in each case, looking at sort of how the SDGs are incorporated in national development plans and social work's role in doing that. So in particular in Ghana and Vietnam, these are examples of how social workers are involved in national development plans, advocating for sustainable development and how those get implemented in national policies, sort of the barriers to doing it. The UAE chapter focuses on analyzing the national welfare state through the sustainable development goals. And the South African chapter focuses on social work's extremely complicated legacy, particularly in South Africa, but of course we know very similar in the United States, a history of exclusion. And what's asking the question, how can social work contribute to implementing SDGs, at the same time dealing with this legacy of exclusion? And the chapter from Chile focuses on the SDGs through the lens of children and adolescents. The national. So the next 4 chapters in part 4 focus on SDG 1, ending poverty, and really interesting group. I want to highlight the chapter from Thailand, which highlights and basically is a case study of what's called the community-based welfare fund, which is a fascinating mutual aid community-based organization where it began among rural farmers who contribute 1 baht per day to this fund. And that's about 3 cents US. And there's over 6,000 of these local funds in the country. And the money is matched by the government. And the estimate is they total today over $30 million US. And social workers have been involved in advising and setting up and helping local leaders to run the funds. It's a really powerful anti-poverty project. The chapter by Argentinian authors is interesting in the sense that they recently had an election where the right-wing president was elected and unfortunately is threatening social work and all the progress that was made previously on sustainable development goals. The chapter from Croatia is focused on their transition to democracy and the role of social work, sort of fighting for place in civil society and the challenges to the new profession. And the chapter on Indonesia focuses on rural poverty, urban challenges, emerging safety net in the country, and the role of social workers in filling the gaps. Then we have 4 chapters that are focused on SDG 3, that focus on health and well-being. The chapter from Uganda details a case study about medical social workers working with a local church to promote the holistic well-being of patients in Uganda. The case study from Japan is fascinating because it details actually 4 different projects. There's a university-based project delivering services to vulnerable students. There's self-help groups for caregivers of elderly population, rural development, and a project with in the town with the highest aging population, which is it's a major issue in Japan. And these case studies, they talk about the role of social work and how the social workers and social work education in the country relates these projects to sustainable development. The Sri Lankan chapter talks about the role of social development opportunities for social work practice and SDGs. And the Indian chapter is focused on analyzing health policy, national health policy. There's chapters focused on gender equality. In particular, the chapter on Qatar is really interesting because it's writing about gender equality from an Arab Islamic social perspective and what that looks like in Qatar. And the chapter on Kyrgyzstan is focused on gender-based violence. We did have 3 chapters that are focused more explicitly on climate change and sustainability. And the case study from China talks about one town, one village that the government has used to promote ecotourism as a tool for poverty alleviation. The chapter on Costa Rica talks about a community-based water policy, where water policy is being decentralized. More local communities have a role in controlling water rights, the role of social workers in helping navigate that. And then the case study from Nigeria is focused on one settlement house, which is really interesting, called the Ulebu neighborhood house in the rural part of Nigeria, where social workers work with the community on environmental and social. And finally, the last part is the part focused on governance, SDG 16, governance, peace, and justice. And this includes 4 chapters. The Colombian chapter focuses on post-conflict reintegration. So after the historic peace accords, there's been a major role of reintegrating former armed combatants back into society. It talks about social work's role in reintegrating that. Actually mirrors a lot of gang programs that we familiar with the United States. The chapter from the Philippines focuses on community organizing and policy advocacy, especially under ex-President Duterte. And in Azerbaijan, there's a focus on reintegrating displaced people from Armenia. And the case from Brazil is a case study of what civil society has done trying to promote the sustainable development goals under the highly authoritarian presidency of Bolsonaro. It's actually notable for having sort of like missing in action social workers. So it was a civil society group promoting sustainable development goals, and social workers didn't join that. Okay, so I've gone over time here, but I just wanted to walk through the different parts because there's a lot in the book, a lot of interesting case studies, and to give you a little sense and flavor for what's there. Hopefully this would be obvious. You would share my point of view that some of the overlap between social work and the SDGs, or some of the alignment is, I think, or the strength, I think, for social work is a person and environment perspective. I think we would agree the goals are intersectional in nature and recognizing the way health is connected to poverty, is connected to access to water, for example. And I think if I can imagine, waking up in 2020, 2030, having achieved the sustainable development goals, I think we could have a social transformation. I think, it's important to in order to sort of row our social work closer to the sustainable development goals, we should align with our own ethical values that we purport to stand for, incorporate more social development, and strengthen our own practice. These are a few of the implications. I want to close with this quote from the former Secretary General when he launched SDGs in 2015, Ban Ki-moon, who said, now we're the first generation that can end poverty, but the last generation that can put us on a path to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. It's part of our mandate, I think, for incorporating sustainability more into social practice. So I think the sustainable development goals are one way to help us to do that. So that's the end. I apologize for going a little bit long. I suppose I got carried away. Thanks for being a great audience. And I just want to finish any presentation that I do related to anything human rights with highlighting my favorite human right, which is Article 24 of the Universal Declaration, which says everybody has the right to rest and leisure. So I know it's Monday, but hopefully you will enjoy maybe afternoon or this weekend and your human right to rest and leisure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's open it up to questions, and I see Philomena raised her hand right away.
Well,
Philomena.
I first want to thank you, David, for presenting to us, and it's wonderful to see you. I haven't seen you in a while. And congratulations on your excellent book. I think we were going to try to incorporate it into our curriculum here. I have a lot of comments, but one question, I mean, it's just really, I'm so happy that the students are being introduced to the SDGs here, because I think we tended to think of some of these goals as being applicable to other people. And I guess my question is, and in some countries take them much more seriously. Laura and I have been involved in study abroads in Costa Rica. And I recently took students to Costa Rica in January, where we looked at the SDGs and how they interface with children's rights. And we were just so pleasantly surprised to see that they really, I mean, sustainable development is a bedrock of their economy. Like they're really trying to, with ecotourism, and I mean, it has its contradictions. I guess my question is, how seriously is the US, implementing the SDGs, and how can we as social workers, push that further?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. I'm glad you're here with us today, and I'd love to hear more about your experiences in Costa Rica. It's a great opportunity. Yeah, I think definitely, like almost anything related to the United Nations, your country or governments have had sort of this sort of sad, exceptionalism point of view. It's like, that's not for us, or we're too important, and that's for other parts of the world. And I think it's a surprise when it shows up in the United States, unfortunately. But when you look at the specific goals, I mean, these are things that people care about in communities all around the country. So it seems like a huge missed opportunity. And I think if we do more, especially like you highlighted, teaching and working with students and educating, students, but also communities about the SDGs, I think there would be, to me, there's obvious alignment with what especially young people in this country want and care about in terms of the political agendas. Is there a messaging or framing issue where do we, lose people if we start talking about United Nations or international things? That's maybe always a concern in the United States, but it doesn't need to be, in the sense that I think if we do messaging, I'm just putting on like community practice limits, about how these issues are related to, the home community, concerns in the country, the people, everyday issues that people face now, whether it's poverty or inequality, access to clean water, let alone urban heat, whatever the other issues are. I think there'd be huge support for that. So I think there's a big role for education. So I think social workers, I think we need to talk about the SDGs, we need to teach about it, and write about it, and let people know there's this framework that already exists that we can use.
We want to add one quick thing, and then Elisa.
Okay,
has a
sorry.
question.
You mentioned, for instance, I think certain goals really are, well, for me, I understand some of the criticisms, but the beauty is the interrelatedness of all the goals, like to end poverty, all these other things are so interrelated. But the US role, people have to also work together. And so the US role, for instance, in consumption is really, affecting the developing countries. Like I do a lot of research in Pakistan, and that's where, they're saying, we're we have limited resources. Our economy is being affected by floods and things like that because of your consumption, you know, that we are contributing to climate change. So I'm just, I guess, supporting the idea that this has to be a global effort.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I'm
There's
just
this-
hog up, but I'm really into this, so.
So we have another question, Elisa.
Thank you for your time, Dr. Androff. This is really great. I'm really interested in your book and I looked it up, it's $224, so someday I'll
Ooh.
save up for it. But I'm really excited to read it someday.
You
And
can
I know we
borrow
have a
mine,
copy here,
Lisa.
so. But what I wanted to ask was, so it's really easy for me to talk to other people and make them kind of turn the light bulb on and realize like, oh my God, this is interrelated, environmental, social work, that does actually make sense. The limitation that I come across though, is in having these conversations with people who actually do have power and have the choice to have the ability to make choices that support people on the ground in living lives that are more sustainable, more resilient, and more holistically well. Have you had any success in having conversations with people who are in a position to actually implement policy that is then effective on the ground?
That's a great question. And I think that's, I mean, yes and no. And I think should be a charge to our whole profession. So don't want to dodge the question, but I would just reflect that we need to, I think, interrogate ourselves as a profession. Have we been able as social work to really push the people in power in this country to do what needs to be done to protect people, from the harms of the economy and from environmental degradation? And I think I had one professor in grad school who said, social work's peak was the New Deal. We've never had as much relevance in political power as the New Deal. And it's exciting to study history, but that was really depressing to think we've sort of fallen from that moment, never had as much power, political power since then. So we desperately need to do more. And I think there's a role for social work research to, make the case, to build the data, to make the case, to make the arguments, to be in those rooms, and to demand, action in the way that you're describing. I think it does come back to advocacy, to community practice, in terms of framing issues, building political power, building social movements. It's not easy and it's not quick, but we have had some success. I mean, I don't want to default, just say, well, it's all about voting, just vote, vote, vote. But
Yeah,
we've had some success in Arizona. I mean, we've had a very strong push to elect a Democratic mayor in the city of Phoenix. Actually, we had the first MSW governor of our state right now, Katie Hobbs. She is an alumni from ASU and actually had her teach a policy practice class before she was elected governor. And now they call her the veto queen, because we have one of those sort of radical state legislatures and just send her, bill after bill after bill that strips people's rights, and she just vetoes every single thing. So I think it's definitely possible, but even that example, it's like certainly not enough.
right.
And more needs to be done. Just real quick on the cost issue. Yeah, it's out of control, but if I don't know if you have access to the library, but through a lot of libraries have 100% electronic access to all the chapters. And I can't send you the whole book, but if there's one particular chapter you're interested in, I can make a PDF and send it as well. So please let me know. So we'd rather people read. Yeah.
So you walked us through the human rights principle and you mentioned transparency and how that relates to anti-corruption. And it's almost like on the state level and national level, like the accountability that happens. I was wondering, when we work with Global South, because there's a lot of corruption. I was born in India myself and I've seen it firsthand. And there's a chapter in the book on national health policy with a case study focused on India. And I was wondering, how do you deal with anti-corruption and transparency in these countries in Global South, such as India?
That's a great question. And that's something we should follow up with the the authors who are at the Tata Institute for Social Sciences in Mumbai who wrote that. And I think you're right that often, it's one thing to write about on the page, this policy and that policy and this program, but it's how does it get implemented? You might be familiar with there's like a core social work concept of like street level bureaucracy. If there's some gatekeeper who's, engaging in corruption around who gets access to services, then it doesn't really matter what the policy says on paper. So it's very challenging. And I think that's why it's essential to have transparency and oversight in monitoring, as well as the rule of law. So that's not something that I highlighted, but that's something that's in there featured as well. And I think it's easy in the United States to take that for granted. In some ways, I'm one of the first to criticize like the legal system and criminal justice system. However, there's basic, there should be basic norms, institutional accountability, where people, treat, if there's a policy that community has universal access, then people don't take, money for that access. It should be open and fair and protected. So that requires oversight. And that requires social workers supporting the rule of law in these cases. And things like independent judiciary and prosecutions when necessary. That's very, very challenging. And I think there needs to be more done. I mean, that's a great angle to focus on, is social work and anti-corruption, particularly in the global South, because we know in most countries, anti-corruption efforts take like a very top level, national level, government level approach, and there's very little attention to the sort of everyday corruption that people face. Trying to get access to services, trying to, to navigate different welfare benefits. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement.
Well, I think we have time for one or two more questions. Any other questions?
Well, while you're thinking of the last question, I just want to also make the point that somebody was raising about this fundamental situation where so much of the global North basically engaged in industrialization and economic growth, fueled by colonialism, that is now having, places that have never had industrialization paying the price and the consequence for, environmental degradation or rising sea levels, for example. And so I have a colleague at ASU that's written about applying transitional justice practices to this relationship to communities and nations in the global South and what's owed by the global North. And I think that's also part of the reparations conversation as well.
Yes, there's been like a push toward climate reparations, right? I see that.
Yeah, that was just a case meeting, I think. Well, I mean, I think an important first step, David, is that we're all speaking the same language of the 193 countries that have signed on. So I think you've done a world of good in helping to move that forward for us and to give us examples. I think one of the things that I appreciate most about the SDGs is that in talking about development, we're supposed to be thinking about environmental dimensions related to development, not just economic. And like you're saying, the social dimension. So there's a big role for social work here. But our definition of development in the US is problematic in itself. So we have to speak the same language, but we also have to move outside of our own, culture sometimes in the way that we view things like development and what progress is. So the examples I find very, very helpful. And even seeing social workers in Costa Rica, for example, working on sanitation and projects like that. So I'm happy to let people borrow my copy at any time. Are there any final questions? I'd like to encourage people to stick around for one moment because I have a couple of things that we can raffle off to folks. I want to let everyone know that there's a survey going out to online and in-person participants because I want your feedback about future discussions. But other than that, thank you so much, David. It was really a pleasure to have you join us today.
Thank you so much. This was such a great pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. Have a great Monday, everybody.
Yeah.